My name is Fonda Marshall. I'm 29 years old, and on my wedding day, I found my father standing alone in a hallway with nowhere to sit while 9 members of my fiancé's family occupied the table that was meant for him. Table 1. Front and center. That's where my parents belonged. Instead, someone had quietly moved them to table 14, the very last table in the ballroom, tucked beside the kitchen doors and only a few feet from a trash station. When I asked my husband to be why, he said something about my father that shattered every excuse I'd been making for him over the previous 2 years. Standing there in my wedding dress with 200 guests waiting just beyond the doors, I made a decision I can never take back, and even now I wouldn't change it. What he said, what I did, and what happened to his family afterward changed every life in that room. But to understand that moment, I need to take you back to the morning of June 14th, the last morning I ever woke up as Garrett Whitfield's fiancé. I grew up in Millfield, Ohio, a town of barely 8,000 people, where the pharmacist knew your blood type, the mail carrier knew your dog's name, and neighbors still waved from their front porches. My parents, Dave and Linda Marshall, built an ordinary life with extraordinary love. Dad was a plumber who spent 35 years wearing the same steel-toed boots, getting them resoled whenever they wore through. His knees gave out after 20 years, his back after 30, but he never once missed a day of work while I was growing up. Every evening he came home, scrubbed the grease from his hands with that gritty orange soap that smelled of citrus and engine oil, then sat beside me at the dinner table and asked the same question. What did you learn today? My mom worked the lunch line at Millfield Elementary, feeding 400 children every day. She knew every child's name, remembered every allergy, and always found a way to give an extra helping to the kids she knew went home to empty cupboards. We never had much money. My bedroom shared a wall with the water heater. My winter coat was usually a hand-me-down from an older cousin, and holidays were modest. But our house was warm, dinner was always waiting, and not once did my parents let me feel poor. They gave me something far more valuable than money. They gave me security. I earned a scholarship, worked my way through university with student loans, became a nurse practitioner at the community clinic on Route 9, and paid off every penny of debt before I turned 28. I built that career with my own determination, but the foundation beneath it was built by Dave and Linda Marshall. I honestly believed a family like mine would be enough for anyone. I was wrong. I met Garrett Whitfield on a Tuesday afternoon nearly 2 years before the wedding. His father, Richard Whitfield, came into the clinic for a routine physical, and Garrett drove him there. While I was carrying a patient chart through reception, Garrett leaned casually against the counter, smiled, and I smiled right back. We had dinner that Friday, another the week after, and before long we were seeing each other every week. Garrett was charming in ways I'd never experienced before. He opened every door, pulled out every chair, remembered little things I mentioned in passing, and took me to elegant restaurants in Columbus where the linen napkins felt heavier than the winter coats I grew up wearing. His family lived in an entirely different world. The Whitfields were wealthy real estate developers whose name appeared on housing developments, shopping plazas, charity plaques, and country club walls. Richard ran the company, Garrett handled acquisitions, and his mother, Constance Whitfield, chaired charity galas and sat on multiple non-profit boards. The first time I met Constance, she wore a cream silk suit and pearl earrings the size of dimes. She shook my hand, looked me up and down with polite precision and said, "A community clinic. How interesting." Garrett used to date Dr. Harrison's daughter over at St. Luke's. She smiled as she said it, but it wasn't warmth. It was comparison dressed as courtesy. I convinced myself that people in wealthy circles were simply more formal, more reserved, that I was reading too much into it. Garrett squeezed my hand beneath the table and whispered, "She'll warm up." She never did. But by then I was already in love, and love has a dangerous habit of explaining away the very warning signs that should send you running. 14 months later Garrett proposed in a private dining room at one of his family's steakhouses, surrounded by candles, flowers, and a string quartet. By pure coincidence, according to Garrett, Constance happened to be dining only a few tables away. I said yes anyway, because I believed I was marrying the man who drove 40 minutes through a snowstorm to bring me homemade soup when I had the flu, the man who texted me every morning, who told me my parents were wonderful people, and who said he couldn't wait to call my father Dad. Then the wedding planning began, and little by little the man I thought I knew started disappearing. Constance chose the venue, the Whitfield Country Club, instead of the little church on Maple Street where my parents had been married. She chose the wedding planner, who also happened to be one of her closest friends. She chose the menu, the flowers, the guest list, and nearly every detail in between. The first time my mother shyly suggested adding her famous fried chicken as one of the cocktail hour appetizers, Constance tilted her head with perfect politeness and said, "That's a lovely idea, Linda. But this is a formal seated reception, not a church potluck." She smiled as if she'd offered a compliment. My mother smiled back. I saw the hurt in her eyes anyway. "Potluck," Constance finished with a smile that never reached her eyes. My mother laughed it off, but I saw the way her hands tightened in her lap. Every time I pushed back, Garrett gave me the same answer. "Let Mom have this one, babe. After the wedding, it's just us. Our own house, our own rules." I wasn't a pushover, I want to be clear about that. I made what I believed was a calculated decision. Lose the small battles now, win the war later. The venue didn't matter. The menu didn't matter. What mattered was the marriage. The 40 years that came after the party. At least that was my logic. And it made perfect sense until I realized those small battles weren't small at all. They were rehearsals. Constance was testing how much control I would surrender, and every time I gave in, she learned she could take a little more. I didn't understand it then, but the wedding day wasn't the war. It was simply the final rehearsal. June 14th. 6 o'clock in the morning. I woke up in my old bedroom at my parents' house. Sunlight spilling through the curtains my mom had sewn when I was 12. My ivory satin floor-length wedding dress hung from the closet door, the one I had bought with my own savings. Constance had tried to convince me to wear a designer gown from an exclusive boutique in Columbus, but I refused. This was the one decision I had kept for myself. By 10 o'clock, I arrived at the Whitfield Country Club. The place looked like something lifted from the pages of a luxury bridal magazine. White peonies overflowed crystal vases, ivory linens covered every table, gold-rimmed chargers gleamed beneath polished glassware, 300 candles flickered throughout the ballroom, and a 12-piece string ensemble warmed up in the garden outside. Nearly $85,000 had been poured into the venue, decor, and catering, almost all of it paid for by the Whitfields. 200 guests were expected. Half belonged to Garrett's world. Business associates, country club members, local politicians, the Hendersons, the Porters, and people whose names carried weight in town. The other half belonged to mine. Aunt Grace from Akron, 3 nurses from the community clinic, my college roommate, old neighbors from Birch Lane, and people who drove pickup trucks, wore department store dresses, and had never heard the phrase charger plate. I noticed the imbalance almost immediately. The Whitfield guests filled the front rows, the prime tables near the dance floor, and the seats closest to the stage. My family and friends were scattered around the edges of the room. Margot, my maid of honor and best friend since freshman orientation, leaned over during the rehearsal and whispered, "Why are all your aunts sitting so far in the back?" I forced a smile and shrugged. "Probably just numbers. Their side has more guests." Margot raised an eyebrow but let it go. The ceremony itself was beautiful. At noon I walked down the aisle, and Garrett stood waiting for me looking flawless, as he always did. That was part of the problem. I had spent so much time admiring the frame that I never stopped to examine what was inside it. After the ceremony, while our guests drifted toward the terrace for cocktails, I slipped quietly into the reception hall to check the final setup. It was simply who I was. I'm a nurse practitioner. I verify everything twice. The ballroom was breathtaking. 20 round tables dressed in crisp white linen, elegant gold place cards displayed on polished brass stands, and table 1, the head table, positioned directly in front of the dance floor and the stage. It had been reserved for both sets of parents, Garrett's grandmother, and my Aunt Grace. I walked over and picked up the first place card. Gerald Whitfield, Constance's brother. The second, Lydia Whitfield. Then Thomas Whitfield. Mr. and Mrs. Porter. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Patricia Whitfield Ross. Gerald Whitfield Jr. 9 Whitfields and close family associates. Not a single Marshall. My chest tightened. I checked another table. Then another. Table 2 Whitfield cousins. Table 3 country club members. Kept searching. Table 10. Table 12. Finally I found them. Table 14. The last table in the room. Tucked against the far wall beside the swinging kitchen doors where I could hear pots clanging behind them. The elegant mahogany chairs used throughout the ballroom were gone, replaced by padded folding chairs normally kept in storage. A service cart piled with dirty glasses sat barely 2 feet away, and the overhead light was dimmer because it was a utility fixture instead of one of the crystal chandeliers. I stared at the place cards. Dave Marshall. Linda Marshall. My parents' names, printed in beautiful gold lettering on expensive cream cardstock, placed beside a trash can with a foot pedal as though they were an afterthought instead of the 2 people who had spent 29 years sacrificing everything to give me the life that had led to this day. My stomach dropped. Then I turned and went looking for the wedding coordinator, Diane. Who changed the seating chart? Yes. Diane, the wedding coordinator, didn't even blink. Mrs. Whitfield adjusted it this morning, she replied. She said the bride approved. I never approved anything. I stood alone in that reception hall and did what years of working in the ER had trained me to do. I assessed the situation like triage. Table 14. Beside the swinging kitchen doors. Clanging pots. Folding chairs instead of polished mahogany. A trash can with a foot pedal sitting barely 2 feet from where my father would eat his daughter's wedding dinner. If I stayed silent, I already knew exactly how the day would unfold. My parents would take those seats without complaint. My dad would straighten the only good tie he owned, the one he bought back in 2009, smile at me and say, "It's fine, sweetheart." My mom would smooth her handmade dress, fold her napkin into her lap, and pretend she couldn't hear the dishwashers crashing only a few feet behind her. And Constance would know. She would know she had won. She would know she could move Dave and Linda Marshall anywhere she pleased, to the back of the room, beside the kitchen, beside the rubbish bin, or completely out of sight, and no one would challenge her. Every Thanksgiving after this, every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering, my parents would always be table 14. The people who didn't quite belong, the ones tucked beside the service entrance so the important guests wouldn't have to look at them. I thought about my father's hands, rough from 35 years of soldering copper pipes and mixing joint compound. Those hands could rebuild an entire bathroom in a single day, and he had worked overtime for 6 months just to buy the suit he planned to wear to my wedding. I thought about my mother's dress. She had sewn it herself, taking an old gown apart, adding lace to the sleeves, replacing the zip, and spending 3 weekends bent over her sewing machine with pins between her lips, determined to make something beautiful because buying a new one wasn't an option. These were the people who raised me, fed me, drove through snowstorms to get me to school, and never once let me believe I had less than anyone else. And someone had decided they belonged beside a rubbish bin. I went looking for Garrett because I believed, truly believed, he would fix it. I thought he would be angry for my parents. I was wrong. For the second time that day. I know some of you listening are thinking about your own parents right now. Maybe they worked double shifts so you could wear braces. Maybe they drove 3 hours to every school play, football game, or graduation. If you've ever had someone look down on your family as though they weren't good enough, then you already know exactly how this feels. And what happened next is the reason I will never allow anyone to treat my parents like they belong at table 14 again. I found Garrett in the groomsmen's suite, standing in front of a full-length mirror adjusting his silver monogrammed cufflinks, a gift from Constance. Who moved my parents from the head table? Yes. He didn't even look away from his reflection. Mom rearranged a few things this morning. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. They don't have seats at the head table, Garrett. Table 14 has seats, he replied calmly. Table 14 is beside the kitchen, I shot back. Beside the rubbish bin. He sighed, the slow, patient sigh of someone convinced I was the unreasonable one. Fonda, we've got 200 guests out there. Can we not do this right now? Then when? Yes. After dinner. After they've already spent 3 hours sitting beside dirty dishes. He finally turned to face me, wearing that calm, reassuring expression he'd perfected over the past 2 years, the face of a man who sounded reasonable while saying something completely unreasonable. Mom has her reasons. The Hendersons and the Porters are sitting at table 1. They're important. More important than my parents. He never actually said those words, but he didn't have to. Every syllable of his answer said them for him. He stepped closer and gently rested a hand on my arm, rehearsed and comforting. Baby, you're stressed. It's your wedding day. Let's get through tonight, and I'll talk to Mom tomorrow. Tomorrow. That word again. Tomorrow after the engagement party. Tomorrow after the bridal shower. Tomorrow after every insult I had swallowed to keep the peace. Tomorrow never came. I searched his face, hoping to find something. Shock, guilt, anger, anything that would tell me he had only just learned about this. There was nothing. No surprise. No outrage. No hesitation. He had known. Maybe since that morning. Maybe longer. He knew my parents had been pushed to the back of the room, and he still got dressed, fastened his cufflinks, straightened his tie, and admired himself in the mirror. Without saying another word, I walked out. But I wasn't finished yet. One more door remained unopened. As I crossed the entrance hall, I stopped beside the welcome table where the guest book rested next to a neat stack of ivory programs embossed with gold lettering. Almost without thinking, I picked one up and opened it. On the second page, beneath the heading "With love and gratitude to our families," was a list of acknowledgements. Richard and Constance Whitfield. Gerald and Lydia Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield. The Whitfield Family Foundation. Line after line of Whitfield names. I slowly turned the page over. I checked the back of the wedding program, then opened it again, hoping I'd somehow missed something. I hadn't. Dave and Linda Marshall were nowhere to be found. In the original version, the one I had personally approved 3 weeks earlier, my parents' names had been listed first beneath the heading, "With deepest love and gratitude to Dave and Linda Marshall, whose sacrifices made all of this possible." I had written those words myself. Constance had reviewed the proof and never objected. She didn't need to. She simply waited until the morning of the wedding and had Diane print a new version, quietly erasing my parents not only from the head table but from the official record of the day. I found Margot outside the bridesmaid's suite touching up her lipstick. One look at my face and she immediately capped it, slipped it into her clutch and asked, "What happened?" I told her everything in less than 30 seconds. The seating chart, the rewritten program, Garrett's response, every humiliating detail. She didn't gasp. She didn't tell me to calm down. She simply looked me in the eye and asked, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. She nodded once. "Then what do you need from me?" "Stay close." She smiled gently. "I'm here, Fonda. I'm right here." She never said "I told you so." 6 months earlier, Margot had warned me about the Whitfields exactly once, then respected my decision to move forward. That quiet loyalty was why I trusted her more than anyone else in the building. I still hadn't decided what I was going to do, but I knew the next few minutes would determine the rest of my life. I walked back toward the groomsmen's suite, intending to give Garrett one final chance. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was prepared to stand in front of him and say, "Fix this, or I don't walk into that reception." But as I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly open, just enough for voices to drift into the hallway. Constance spoke first, her voice low and perfectly controlled, the way it always was when she was being the most ruthless. "Garrett, look at her father. That suit must be from 2005. And her mother. My goodness, did she sew that dress herself? They look poor. You cannot have them sitting at the front table. Our guests will notice." Garrett answered without hesitation. "I know, Mom. The Hendersons are sitting there. Jim Porter and his wife too. They're the people who matter." Constance continued. "Exactly. I'm sorry, but not a plumber and a lunch lady. Then Garrett said the sentence that shattered everything I believed about him. You're right. The Marshalls are fine in the back. It's more appropriate. After a brief pause, Constance added quietly, You should have listened to me from the beginning. She doesn't belong here. Those 4 words echoed through me like a slammed door. She doesn't belong here. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself as the hallway seemed to tilt. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing, the strange calm that comes just before everything changes forever. My father, the man who had spent 35 years crawling beneath kitchen sinks so I could have opportunities he never did. The man with worn-out knees, one good suit, and a habit of driving 4 hours every weekend just to make sure I was eating enough in college, had been reduced to a plumber. My mother, who fed hundreds of children every school day and quietly made sure the hungry ones always received an extra helping, had been dismissed as a lunch lady. Those weren't descriptions. They were insults. And the man I was about to marry had agreed with every word. There are sentences you can forget over time. This wasn't one of them. I stepped away from the wall. My hands had stopped shaking. Everything inside me became perfectly still, the same stillness that settles over an emergency room just before a trauma team begins working. I pushed the door open. Constance turned first. Surprise flickered across her face for barely half a second before she replaced it with her polished society smile. Fonda, sweetheart, she said smoothly. You look absolutely stunning. I looked directly at her. I heard everything. Garrett's expression tightened. Heard what? Dad looks poor. Mom sewed her dress. They don't belong at the front table. I held his eyes. Which part exactly did I misunderstand? Constance stepped forward with her practiced charity board composure. Fonda, this is only a seating arrangement. We're simply trying to make sure. You called my father a plumber as though it were something to be ashamed of, I interrupted. You called my mother a lunch lady like her life's work had no value. I didn't mean, she began. I turned to Garrett before she could finish. And you said they were fine in the back. That it was more appropriate. Garrett lowered his voice, hoping calm would somehow erase cruelty. But by then I wasn't listening to excuses anymore. I was listening to the truth that had finally revealed itself. Smooth. The same measured voice Garrett used in client meetings whenever a deal started falling apart. You're emotional right now, Fonda. It's your wedding day. Let's take a breath. I looked him straight in the eyes. I am breathing, Garrett. And I've never been more clear. Constance shot him a sharp glance, the kind that silently ordered, handle this. Garrett tried again. Baby, come on. Let's not ruin today. I shook my head. I'm not ruining anything. You already did. Then I turned and walked away. The hallway stretched ahead of me, 60 feet of polished hardwood leading toward the reception hall. Behind me, I heard Constance hiss something at Garrett, too quietly to make out, but he never came after me. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. I didn't head into the reception. Not yet. Instead, I went looking for the only person in that building who had never once made me feel like I wasn't enough. Margot was exactly where I'd left her, leaning against the wall outside the bridesmaid's suite like a guard standing watch. Tell me, she said. So I did. Every word. Constance calling my father a plumber, and my mother a lunch lady, as though honest work was something to be ashamed of. Garrett agreeing with her. Every humiliating sentence. Margot didn't gasp or interrupt. She listened. When I finished, she stayed silent for 5 long seconds before asking, What are you thinking? I swallowed hard. I'm thinking I can't sign my name to this. She nodded once. Practical. Then here's what you need to know. She lowered her voice. The ceremony is over, but the marriage license hasn't been signed yet. Diane still has it. Remember. Constance wanted the signing to happen after dinner at the sweetheart table so everyone could watch. My heart stopped. I remembered. The vows, the rings, the ceremony. None of it was legally binding yet. Until that license was signed, witnessed, and filed with the county, we weren't married. So, legally, yes. Legally, you're still free, Margot replied. No signature means no marriage. No annulment. No divorce. Nothing. The words settled over me like a door quietly unlocking. How long do I have? As long as you don't sign. But once you walk into that reception, once the speeches begin and Diane brings out the paperwork in front of 200 guests, the pressure will be enormous. I nodded slowly. I know. She rested a steady hand on my arm. I'm your lawyer first and your best friend second tonight. Whatever you decide, I'm standing beside you. I took a deep breath and walked to table 14. My parents were exactly where Constance had left them, tucked against the kitchen entrance, beside the swinging service door. Dad sat perfectly upright with his hands resting on his knees, his old suit pressed, his tie carefully straightened, his shoes polished with the same cheap drugstore polish he'd used for years. Mum sat beside him, smoothing the skirt of the dress she had altered herself after 3 weekends bent over a sewing machine, replacing the zip, adding lace to the sleeves, making an old dress look beautiful because buying a new one wasn't in the budget. Behind them, the kitchen door burst open with a loud bang as a server hurried through carrying trays. The crash of plates echoed into the room. Mum flinched. Dad didn't. He simply smiled when he saw me. Hey, sweetheart. You look beautiful. My throat tightened. Dad, I'm so sorry about. He gently raised one hand to stop me. Don't, baby girl. I can sit anywhere. This is your day. Then he looked at me for a long, quiet moment. There was no anger in his eyes. No bitterness. Just understanding, as though somehow he already knew I was standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. My mind drifted to the £12,000 my parents had spent over 15 years saving, little by little from a plumber's wages and a school cafeteria worker's paycheck. That money had paid the catering deposit. Every plate, every glass, every dessert those 200 guests would enjoy that evening. Without my parents' sacrifice, there would have been no reception at all. Yet the very people who had made this celebration possible had been pushed to the worst seats in the room, beside the kitchen door and a rubbish bin, as though they were an embarrassment to be hidden away. In that moment, standing between the people who had given me everything and the family I was about to marry into, I finally understood something I should have realized long before. This wasn't about a seating chart. It never had been. It was about respect. And if the man I was about to marry couldn't stand beside my parents on the happiest day of our lives, then he would never stand beside me when life became difficult. At that table, beside the clatter of dishes and the smell of the kitchen, my decision was made. I wasn't about to become Mrs. Whitfield. I was about to save myself. Stay here, I said, looking at both of my parents. I'll be right back. My mother reached for my hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Fonda, don't make trouble on our account. I squeezed her hand gently and met her eyes. I'm not making trouble, Mom. I'm finishing it. Then I turned and walked away. The reception doors opened as nearly 200 guests streamed inside, welcomed by the soft sound of the string ensemble playing Pachelbel's canon like a lullaby written for wealthy people. From the edge of the ballroom, I watched everyone find their assigned seats. The Whitfield guests settled comfortably into the front tables with the confidence of people accustomed to being honored. My family and friends wandered toward the back, checking place cards and pulling out chairs that didn't even match the elegant furniture in the rest of the room. It was impossible to ignore the difference. Derek, Garrett's fraternity brother and the evening's MC, stepped up to the microphone with a broad smile. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the families of our beautiful couple. He gestured proudly toward table 1. The Whitfield family. 9 people stood to warm applause. Constance smiled like a queen greeting her court. Richard offered a modest wave. Gerald and Lydia Whitfield raised their champagne glasses while guests applauded politely. Then Derek glanced down at his cue card, skipped over my parents entirely, and continued. And now let's raise a glass to love. That was it. No mention of Dave and Linda Marshall. No acknowledgement of the people who had sacrificed their entire lives so I could stand there that day. Across the room, Patricia, my charge nurse and mentor in the emergency department, walked toward table 14 carrying a plate of appetizers. She stopped when she saw the folding chairs, the kitchen door, and my parents sitting beside the service entrance. Her expression hardened immediately. She placed the plate on the table, turned around, and walked straight toward me. "Fonda," she said quietly in the same calm voice she used during medical emergencies, "why are your parents sitting next to the service entrance?" "I'm handling it, Pat." She looked me straight in the eye. "That man rebuilt the plumbing in my house after my pipes burst in January. He charged me half his normal rate and refused every tip I offered." He nodded. "I know." Her jaw tightened. "Then why is he eating beside a rubbish bin at his own daughter's wedding?" Before I could answer, I noticed movement at table 1. Jim Henderson, Richard Whitfield's biggest business partner, leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She turned, looked all the way across the ballroom toward table 14, frowned and whispered back. Other guests were beginning to notice as well. The cracks in the Whitfields' carefully polished image were finally starting to show. The first course arrived moments later. Butternut squash bisques served in elegant white porcelain bowls, each one decorated with delicate microgreens. Every bowl had been paid for by the £12,000 my parents had quietly saved over 15 years. A plumber's pension. Cafeteria workers' wages. Every spoonful came from their sacrifice. Constance left table 1 with her friend Vivian and walked toward the bar. Their path took them directly past table 14. I stood near the dessert station, only a few meters away, close enough to see every expression and hear every word. My mother was carefully adjusting the lace on the sleeve of the dress she had altered herself. A few inches of stitching had come loose, and she was discreetly trying to tuck the thread underneath so no one would notice. Constance stopped, glanced at the sleeve, then turned toward Vivian with that perfectly rehearsed smile. "Bless her heart," she said sweetly. "Someone really should have bought her a proper dress." She lifted her champagne flute before adding, "But I suppose you have to know your place." She spoke softly enough to pretend it was private, yet loudly enough that my mother could hear every single word. Mom's hands froze. She stopped adjusting the sleeve and lowered her eyes to the table. Without saying a word, my father reached beneath the tablecloth and took her hand. He simply held it. I have watched patients die. I have comforted parents after impossible diagnoses. I have seen tragedies in the emergency room that still visit me in quiet moments. But nothing, not one of those memories, hurt more than watching my father, the strongest man I have ever known, sit silently beside a rubbish bin while my mother swallowed humiliation because someone with more money believed they were less worthy. For the first time in my life, I saw shame on my father's face. Not shame for who he was, but shame for being placed somewhere he never deserved to be and knowing there was nothing he could do to protect the woman he loved. In that instant, something inside me settled forever. I was done. Completely. Irreversibly. I crossed the ballroom, grabbed Garrett gently but firmly by the arm, and led him behind one of the marble columns where nearby guests couldn't hear us. "Your mother just humiliated mine in front of everyone." He frowned. "What did she say?" "Someone should have bought her a proper dress." "Know your place." Garrett rubbed his hand across his hair and sighed. "Fonda. Mom says things she doesn't mean." I stared at him in disbelief. "She meant every single syllable, Garrett. And you know it." He looked uncomfortable. "Can we please just get through dinner?" "Go over there," I said quietly. "Tell your mother to apologize. Right now." He looked across the ballroom. Constance was laughing with Vivian beside the bar. Jim Henderson and the other guests at table 1 continued chatting while the string quartet played another elegant melody. Garrett looked at the scene for several seconds before turning back to me. His face was calm. "Come. I'm not making a scene, Fonda. 200 people are watching." I held his gaze without blinking. "Then whisper," I replied. "I don't care how you do it. Just do the right thing for once." "Just do it," I said. Garrett straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and then spoke the sentence that ended our relationship forever. "Your parents will be fine. They're tough. Let's just get through tonight." Then he turned his back on me, walked calmly to table 1, settled into his gilded chair, and picked up his wine glass. Constance leaned over with a satisfied smile and gently patted his arm, as though he had passed some invisible test. I stood alone behind the marble column while the string quartet drifted into another Vivaldi piece. Servers glided past carrying trays of perfectly seared salmon, my parents' 12,000-pound salmon. Around me, 200 guests laughed, toasted, and clinked crystal glasses in a ballroom where the people who had sacrificed the most for this day didn't even have seats worthy of them. In that moment, everything became painfully simple. Garrett had made his choice. He chose the table. He chose the room. He chose his mother. Now it was my turn to choose. I walked directly to table 14 and sat between my parents instead of taking my seat at the sweetheart table beside the groom. My mother looked at me with quiet confusion. "Honey, you should be up front." I smiled sadly. "My family is here, so I'm here." Dad studied my face. After 29 years, he knew every expression I had. He could always tell when I was about to do something that couldn't be undone. "Fonda," he said softly, "don't do anything because of us." I looked him in the eye. "I'm not doing this for you, Dad. I'm doing it for me." Across the ballroom, I caught Margot's gaze. She had already been watching. I gave her a single nod. She answered with one of her own, reached beneath the table for her clutch, and quietly stood. I drew one deep breath, then another, pushed my chair back and rose to my feet. The walk from table 14 to the stage was no more than 60 feet, but it felt like the longest walk of my life. My heels clicked across the polished hardwood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step sounding like a countdown. One conversation stopped, then another. Heads turned table by table until the entire ballroom fell silent. By the time I reached the stage, every eye in the room was on me. Derek, Garrett's fraternity brother and the evening's MC, was halfway through a story about their college years when he noticed me approaching. His smile faltered. "Oh, the bride, everyone." A few scattered claps echoed awkwardly through the room. I gently took the microphone from his hand. He surrendered it without protest. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and nervous amusement. I turned to face the crowd. 200 faces. Crystal glasses. White linens. Gold place cards. At table 1 sat Constance with her champagne, Garrett rigid beside her, and Richard staring silently at his plate. Behind me, tucked into the far corner beside the kitchen entrance, sat my parents at table 14. Across the room, I saw Constance lean toward Garrett. I couldn't hear her words, but I read her lips easily. "What is she doing?" I adjusted the microphone. When I spoke, my voice carried through the ballroom, calm, steady, and completely free of tears. 7 years in emergency medicine had taught me how to stay composed while everything around me fell apart. "Thank you all for being here today," I began. "I know you came to celebrate a wedding, but before this evening goes any further, I owe every one of you the truth about what has happened in this room." The final whispers disappeared. The silence became absolute. I could actually hear the ice settling inside a glass somewhere near table 6. "Most of you know me today as Garrett Whitfield's fiancé," I continued. "But before I was that, and long after tonight, I will always be Dave and Linda Marshall's daughter." I raised my hand and pointed toward the back of the ballroom. "My parents are sitting at table 14. I'd like everyone to look at table 14 for just a moment." Every head turned. 200 pairs of eyes swept past the elegant center tables, beyond the dance floor, beyond the dessert station, all the way to the far corner where my parents sat at a folding table squeezed between a service cart, the swinging kitchen door, and a rubbish bin. I watched understanding spread across the room like a slow-moving storm. First came confusion, then recognition, then outrage. Jim Henderson quietly laid down his fork. His wife, Carol, covered her mouth with one hand. Patricia, the charge nurse who had trained me, closed her eyes and slowly shook her head. At table 1, Constance's smile hardened into something brittle and lifeless. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute until her knuckles turned white. Garrett sat perfectly still beside her. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. 12 hours ago, I continued. My parents were assigned seats right here at table 1, where the families of the bride and groom belong. That was the seating chart I personally approved. I paused, letting the words settle over the room. This morning someone changed it. Someone removed my parents' names from the head table, replaced every place card, and quietly reassigned them to the worst seats in the ballroom, beside the kitchen, beside the service entrance, and beside the rubbish bin. I lowered the microphone slightly and let the silence do what no speech ever could. Every person in that room now understood exactly who the Whitfields really were. I let the silence settle over the ballroom and watched the truth do what no argument ever could. The person who changed the seating chart, I said calmly, was Constance Whitfield. Every head at table 1 turned toward her at once. Constance remained perfectly still, her chin lifted with practiced dignity, but all the color had drained from her face. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute until her knuckles turned white. Richard lowered his eyes to the tablecloth, unable or unwilling to look at anyone. When I confronted my fiancé about what his mother had done, I continued, my voice steady and clinical, the same tone I used when reading patient charts during hospital rounds. He told me not to make a scene. I paused for only a heartbeat before adding, and when I overheard him speaking privately with his mother, these were his exact words. The Marshalls are fine in the back. The Hendersons and the Porters are more important. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Jim Henderson slowly pushed his chair back, not dramatically, but just enough to place distance between himself and the Whitfields. His wife, Carol, stared at Garrett with the same expression I had seen countless times in the emergency room, the look people wear when they suddenly realize they have been standing beside something dangerous. Garrett rose from his chair. Fonda, that's not. Sit down, Garrett. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You had every opportunity to stand up for my family, and you chose not to. He remained standing for another 3 seconds until Constance quietly tugged at his sleeve. Like always, he obeyed and sat back down. The ballroom became so silent I could hear the kitchen door creak on its hinges. Somewhere near the middle of the room, my Aunt Grace whispered, "Tell them, sweetheart," just loud enough for me to hear. I turned slightly, enough to catch my father in the corner of my eye. He was sitting exactly as he always had during difficult moments, back straight, hands resting on the table, saying nothing. My father, Dave Marshall, I said, spent 35 years fixing broken pipes. He has 2 bad knees, 1 good suit, the one he's wearing tonight, and he saved for 6 months just to buy it. At table 9, a woman quietly pressed a napkin to her eyes. My mother, Linda Marshall, serves lunch to 400 children every school day at Millfield Elementary. She knows every child by name. She knows who has a peanut allergy, who can't have dairy, and who comes to school hungry. Those children always receive an extra helping because that's the kind of woman she is. I faced the front tables once more. My parents contributed £12,000 to this wedding. They saved that money over 15 years. It paid the catering deposit. I let the numbers sink into the room. Guests slowly looked down at the seared salmon on their plates, the butternut squash bisque, the wine in their crystal glasses. Every meal you're enjoying tonight was paid for by my parents. Then I looked directly at Constance. And you seated them beside the rubbish bin. The ballroom fractured beneath a wave of gasps. Vivian quietly set down her champagne and instinctively moved several inches away from Constance, no longer wanting to be associated with her. At the back of the room, a man from the Millfield side rose silently to his feet. Then Patricia stood. Then Aunt Grace. One after another, more people stood without saying a word. They didn't need speeches. They simply stood like witnesses to the truth. Constance opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Garrett stared down at his untouched dinner. Richard Whitfield still hadn't found the courage to look up. "I came here today believing I was beginning a marriage," I said. "A partnership. A life built on mutual respect." My voice never cracked. I refused to let it. But I will not sign my name to a marriage where my family is treated like an embarrassment. I will not raise children who grow up believing that love means being ashamed of where you come from. Slowly, I reached up and removed my veil. I folded it once, then twice, then a third time, carefully placing it on the edge of the stage exactly as my mother had taught me, because even when you let something go, you let it go with dignity. I turned toward the guests from Millfield. Thank you for driving all this way. Thank you for celebrating with my family. We're going home. Then I faced the Whitfields one final time. I truly wish you well. I hold no hatred in my heart. But I deserve better than a man who remains silent while his mother humiliates my parents. And my parents deserve far better than table 14. I gently placed the microphone back onto its stand. I didn't slam it. I didn't drop it. I set it down the way you put away a trusted tool once the job is finished. Then I stepped off the stage and walked across the ballroom, my heels echoing against the polished hardwood in the same calm, steady rhythm as before. Only this time, no one spoke over the sound. My father stood the moment I reached him. My mother's cheeks were wet with quiet tears, the kind she always tried to hide. I wrapped my arms around both of them there in the corner of the ballroom, between the folding chairs and the swinging kitchen door where they never should have been seated in the first place. Moments later, Margot appeared carrying my coat and handbag. She had already called a car. Together, the four of us walked toward the exit, past the dessert station, past the silent string quartet that had stopped playing, and past 200 speechless guests who watched us leave, knowing they had just witnessed the end of a wedding, and the beginning of something far more important, a woman choosing her dignity over a lifetime of quiet humiliation. Behind us, I heard Constance's voice rise, sharp, brittle, and laced with panic. "She's lost her mind," she shouted. Then came Garrett's voice, echoing through the ballroom. "Fonda. Fonda, wait." I didn't slow down. I didn't turn around. The doors closed behind us, shutting out the music, the whispers, and the people I had just left behind. The only sound that remained was my own breathing. If you're still listening, then you already understand why I walked away. But I want to hear from you too. Has anyone ever made you feel as though your family wasn't good enough? As though your parents didn't belong? If you know that feeling, write "not table 14" in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity is worth more than any wedding. But walking out of that ballroom wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table in my parents' house where I had done my homework since 3rd grade. It was still the old formica table with chrome legs and the tiny chip in the corner from the cast-iron skillet I dropped in high school. Mum quietly made coffee while Dad sat across from me without saying a word. That was his way of saying everything. At exactly 9:15 p.m. my phone rang. It was Margot. "The marriage license is still unsigned," she said. I confirmed it with Diane. She still has the original document. It was never signed, never witnessed, and never filed with the county. Legally, you were never married. Not even for a single second. No annulment. No divorce. Nothing. You walked away completely free. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath as one of the tightest knots in my chest finally loosened. "There's more," Margot continued. "Under Ohio law, Garrett may try to claim shared property because you live together. But the lease is in your name, your finances are separate, and you're in a very strong legal position." "Okay," I whispered. "One last thing," she added. "He's been calling. 17 missed calls from Garrett. 3 from Constance. 1 from Richard. Block them all." Already done. After we hung up, the house fell quiet again. Dad had gone upstairs to bed, and Mum stood at the sink washing coffee mugs by hand even though the dishwasher sat empty. She always washed dishes herself whenever she was worried. My phone remained silent now. No more messages swinging wildly between "baby, I'm sorry" and "you humiliated my family. You'll regret this." None of it mattered anymore. I didn't need Garrett's apology. I needed him to have stood up 6 hours earlier and said, "That's my wife's family. Put them back where they belong." He never did. And there are some moments you can never undo once you've lived through them. Mum dried the final mug, placed it gently in the cupboard, leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Your father is too. He's just never been very good at saying it." 2 weeks later, I found myself kneeling on the bathroom floor at 7 in the morning after being sick. Then again at noon. Then again at 4. On my way home, I stopped at the CVS on Route 9, where Gail, the pharmacist who had known me since I was 6 years old, quietly scanned a pregnancy test without asking a single question. She simply handed me the bag with a gentle smile that somehow said everything. Back home, I stared at 2 unmistakable pink lines. Positive. I sat on the cold bathroom tiles and cried. Not the joyful tears you see in pregnancy announcements, but the heavy tears of someone whose future had just become infinitely more complicated. The grout beneath me was the same grout my father had installed back in 1998. I was about to become a mother, and the father of my child was the man I had walked away from in front of 200 guests. One question came immediately. Do I tell Garrett? The answer came just as quickly. My child deserved to know both parents. But informing him did not mean returning to him. Did not mean doubting myself. And it certainly did not mean exchanging my dignity for a comfortable life wrapped in Whitfield money. About an hour later, Mum came into the bathroom looking for fresh towels. She saw the pregnancy test resting on the counter and froze. Without asking a single question, she lowered herself onto the cold tile beside me, despite her aching knees, wrapped one arm around my shoulders and simply held me. "You're not alone," she whispered. "You've never been alone." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "I know." She smiled through her own tears. "Your dad is going to lose his mind." She paused before adding with a small laugh. "In the best possible way." For the first time all day I almost smiled. Life had suddenly become much harder, but harder didn't mean wrong. And being on my own didn't mean being abandoned. Not with parents who would sit beside me on a cold bathroom floor without me ever having to ask. I told Garrett the truth in an email. Margot reviewed every word before I pressed send. It contained only 3 short sentences. Professional, direct, and final. "I'm pregnant. I'm keeping the baby. If you wish to pursue parental rights, all future communication will go through legal counsel." Garrett's response came in waves. The first email arrived only hours later. "Come home, Fonda. We'll raise this baby together. We can fix this." 4 hours after that came the second. "My family will fight for custody. You have no idea what you're up against." Then, just after midnight, the third appeared in my inbox. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." 3 emails. 3 completely different versions of the same man. One begging, one threatening, one predicting disaster. Yet every one of them came from the man who couldn't find the courage to stand up to his own mother over a simple seating chart. Then Constance tried another approach. She had realized I'd blocked her number, so she called my parents' house instead. Dad answered while I stood quietly in the kitchen doorway listening. "Mr. Marshall," Constance said in her perfectly polished voice, "I trust you understand this child is a Whitfield. We have the best attorneys in the county." Dad looked over at me. I gave him a small nod. He returned his attention to the receiver. "Mrs. Whitfield," he replied calmly, "my daughter has a lawyer. If you have something to say, talk to her attorney, not to me." Then he gently hung up the phone, placed it back on the cradle, and returned to drinking his coffee as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That simple moment told me more about strength than any expensive speech ever could. Later that week, Margot introduced me to one of her colleagues, Hannah Wells, a respected custody attorney from Columbus. Hannah didn't waste time with false reassurance. "Ohio courts favor the child's best interests," she said. "You have stable employment, a strong support system, and no history of instability. His family's wealth is not a legal argument." Those words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. From that moment forward, everything happened through proper legal channels. No emotional phone calls, no dramatic confrontations, no late-night negotiations. Just paperwork, deadlines, legal filings, and firm boundaries. Constance had proudly declared that the Whitfields had the finest lawyers in the county. Perhaps they did. But they didn't have what I had. A woman who had stopped being afraid of them on a Saturday afternoon in June. The fallout came quietly. There were no screaming headlines or public scandals. Only the slow erosion of the reputation the Whitfields had spent decades building. The following Monday, Jim Henderson reportedly called Richard Whitfield. I never heard the conversation myself. It reached me later through the familiar chain of small-town connections. Margot heard it from Hannah, who heard it from a paralegal whose husband played golf with Henderson. According to the story, Richard asked, "Jim, what does a wedding have to do with a business deal?" Henderson's answer was simple. "If that's how your family treats the people closest to you, I have to wonder how you'd treat a business partner when things become difficult." Shortly afterwards, Henderson withdrew from the Oak Ridge development, a mixed-use project worth well over £300,000 in his share alone. Richard was forced to search for a new investor, and the project stalled for nearly 8 months. 3 weeks after the wedding, the Hope Foundation's board met behind closed doors. Constance had chaired their annual gala for 6 consecutive years and had raised more money than anyone before her. But donors had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Board members worried about appearances. No one publicly dismissed her. That's not how influence works in a town like ours. Instead, she was quietly encouraged to step back and focus on family. When the gala program was printed that September, her name was nowhere to be found. I want to be absolutely clear. I did not orchestrate any of it. I never contacted Jim Henderson. I never called the Hope Foundation. I never posted anything online or tried to ruin anyone's reputation. Outside of Margot and my parents, I told no one what happened behind that ballroom door. I didn't need to. 200 people had watched Constance Whitfield relegate a plumber and a school cafeteria worker to a folding table beside a rubbish bin. 200 people went home carrying that memory with them. Consequences don't always arrive with shouting or public humiliation. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of a Monday morning phone call that changes everything. About a month after the wedding, Garrett appeared at my parents' front door. I was upstairs when I heard the knock, followed by the familiar creak of the screen door and my father's calm voice. "Garrett." "Mr. Marshall," Garrett answered. "I came to apologize. I was hoping I could speak with Fonda. She told you to communicate through her lawyers." "I know what she said," Garrett replied. "But I wanted to say this in person. I should have handled things differently. I should have stood up for your family." From the upstairs window I watched them. Dad stood in the doorway with his hands relaxed at his sides while Garrett waited one step below on the front path, looking up at him. "You should have," Dad said quietly. Garrett hesitated. "Can I see her?" "5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Dad didn't move an inch. He didn't cross his arms or raise his voice. He simply stood there the way he had stood in every doorway throughout my life. Steady, dependable, impossible to push aside. "My daughter made herself perfectly clear," he replied. "If you want to be part of this child's life, Hannah Wells has all the paperwork you need. That's the path forward." For the first time, Garrett's carefully polished composure cracked. What surfaced wasn't genuine remorse. It was frustration. The frustration of a man who had spent his life getting his own way and couldn't understand why the script had suddenly changed. He looked at my father and finally said, "You're going to regret this. My family isn't going to let this go." Dad never blinked. "Son," he answered, his voice calm and unwavering, "the day my daughter walked away from your family was the day she stopped fearing what you might do. You should learn the difference."